You know, probably the most contentious question on Idaho's November general election ballot, other than who's going to lead the country for the next 4 years, will be how the Gem State selects its state and county leaders. Proposition 1 would repeal Idaho's allowance of closed party primaries. It would instead install an open primary, a blanket primary, where the top 4 vote getters, regardless of affiliation, would advance to the November general election. Who ultimately wins that race or that election, the general election, would then be determined by ranked choice voting. Prop 1, if passed, and stop me if you've heard this before, would fundamentally change Idaho's elections. Supporters say it's about time, but opponents claim it would fracture our democratic foundation. But it's not like this would be the first time Idaho's elections fundamentally changed. On the first Saturday of June in 2007, the Idaho GOP gathered in Burley for their annual summer meeting. And that day, in a vote that would split the party, the Idaho Republican Central Committee passed a rule to close its primary election, which had been wide open since the early 1970s. Now, going into that weekend, even the party chair at the time questioned its necessity. My first question, what is broken? Kirk Sullivan told the Associated Press, pointing to the fact 79 of 105 lawmakers and all the state elected positions were filled with Republicans at the time. Why do we need to change the rules? Sullivan asked. Well, in today's look into Prop 1 and the history of open and closed primaries in Idaho, we're starting where it all started, in June of 2007.
Richard Slack has voted.
For more than 35 years, Idaho has had open primary elections in which voters can cast ballots for whomever they want, irrespective of their party affiliation. But some Republicans want to change that. Members of the GOP's Central Committee voted over the weekend to close the Republican primaries, meaning you would need to be a registered member of that party in order to vote, something that has never happened in Idaho's history. It is a controversial move, which many fear will disenfranchise independent voters. In fact, many of Idaho's top Republicans oppose the change, including Senator Larry Craig, Governor Butch Otter, the Secretary of State, and the Republican Party's own chairman. But the majority of those in the Central Committee voted to the contrary.
If you're going to be a Republican and vote in the Republican primary, you need to be a member of the Republican Party.
Might this alienate some of those independents, of which there are believed to be quite a few in Idaho, that they might then just go to the Democrats?
I don't think so. I think the Republican Party is stronger than it's ever been, and I think we will continue that trend.
Well, I don't think it's good for the state.
Keith Allred is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and a fifth-generation Idahoan. He says it's well documented that closed primaries produce candidates with more extreme views, be they Republican or Democratic.
Whether you're conservative or liberal, we all have an interest in our government being representative of who we are as Idahoans. Closed primaries give you less representative winners. They represent less well the broad swath of Idahoans and will represent more one wing of one party. And I just don't think that can be good for the state.
A sentiment echoed by Idaho Democrats.
But I think this is one in a series of events that will change Idaho politics. There's going to be a real fight in the Republican Party for control of the center.
First, though, change has to be implemented, and just when and how that happens is a bit ambiguous at this point. Since party rule trumps state law, Republicans will most likely sue the Secretary of State to get the primary process changed. A U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 2000 sets the precedent and paves the way for such action. But then there's the issue of getting voters to register with their party. How does the state manage that with 700,000 registered voters? And one of the biggest questions, what happens to independents? Allison Uten, Idaho's News Channel 7.
At the time, there weren't any solid answers to the questions. How does the state manage the registration? And what about independent, unaffiliated voters? As for the fight for the central part of that party, they kind of kicked that to the curb, haven't they? Well, they would have years to figure out those other questions that Allison brought up in 2007. In 2000, as she mentioned, U.S. Supreme Court had already ruled it was legal for parties to close their primaries. So Idaho's GOP was, well, where they were hoping to have it done by 2010. However, it would take a couple of lawsuits and a legislative session to open Idaho to closed primaries. There was the initial lawsuit in 2007, which was dismissed because plaintiff Rod Beck didn't have the standing to sue the Secretary of State, Ben Usursa. Then a new lawsuit was filed in 2008, this time by the whole state Republican Party. That lawsuit was finally decided in March of 2011 by a district court, a federal district court, with Judge Windmill ruling Idaho's open primary rule violated the GOP's First Amendment rights. The ruling came just in time for lawmakers to then pass House Bill 351 on the second to last day of that session, which would allow parties to close primaries. That also, which the Republican Party did, I guess, for the May primary of 2012. Well, then came the Open Primaries Initiative of 2024, with Reclaim Idaho turning in more than enough signatures to get Prop 1 on the November ballot. The reason, they say, to open up Idaho's elective process to the nearly 300,000 unaffiliated voters in Idaho, unable to vote in a closed primary. The Democratic Party currently in Idaho, the only open primary in the state. In that story from 2007, we heard from Keith Allred, at the time a fifth-generation Idahoan, still is, and he was then a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Well, now, Allred said then closed primaries produce candidates with more extreme views, be they Republican or Democratic, didn't matter. Today, Allred is the executive director for the National Institute for Civil Discourse. He's been in Washington, D.C. for the past 6 years, but he's been watching what has been happening in politics in his home state. So what has he noticed since 2007?
Well, Idaho really reflects national trends, and that is that the extremes are gaining more and more control, and that makes it really tough in our system. The founders purposely created a system that would make it virtually impossible to pass things on purely partisan bases. But now, whether it's the Idaho legislature or any other state legislature or the American Congress, the members of both parties are ever more intent on just trying to impose their will on everyone else.
Do you stand by kind of what you said back in 2007? Whether you're conservative or liberal, we all have an interest in our government being representative
of who we are as Idahoans. Closed primaries give you less representative winners. They represent less well the broad swath of Idahoans and will represent more one wing of one party. And I just don't think that can be good for the state.
Yeah, the evidence is much stronger now than it was then. So it's even truer now than what I said then. It's been very interesting to see. There's just much more research on this in 2024 than there was in 2007. Closed primaries tend to play to the extreme wings of both parties, and it's ironic, Brian, both parties, it's one thing they can agree on is they oppose these kinds of initiatives because they fear it will take away their power and, those that are beholden to the extremes.
There's been a lot of confusion, and you can thank the Republicans for the confusion.
Since 2012,
the Republicans are the only party choosing to close their election to just Republicans.
We invite all like-minded Idahoans to join us in our party selection process, to affiliate as a Republican and have a say in who our nominee will be for the November elections.
There are still a lot of people in Idaho who don't want to be affiliated with a party, any party. We pride ourselves on being independent.
just looking at the numbers doesn't tell the whole story, according to Allred. It was January 2014. Now, the primaries had already been in play, but at that point, 60% of the registered voters in Idaho were independent or unaffiliated. And today, it is 60% Republican, 13% Democrat, 27% independent or unaffiliated. What does that tell you?
Well, that's not a very accurate measure of people's true feelings, because you can only participate in the Republican primary if you register. And so that first number is far more representative of where people really are. And it kind of points to one of the criticisms of these kinds of primary systems, is that it really doesn't treat independents fairly. The particulars really matter. So you have simply closed primaries, but there's a lot of different versions of open primaries, and those details tend to matter. And from what we know of from the evidence so far, the version that Idaho has picked is the most promising version that has been tried.
How so? What do you mean when you say promising that has been tried? How is it the most promising?
Well, that it is the most effective at producing winners that are the most representative of everybody in the state. The reason these come about is because people recognize that we're not getting representatives that really represent the full voice of Idahoans.
Okay, so what about that full voice of Idahoans? Does the current system of a closed primary represent all of Idaho voters, or just the extreme factions? So let's take a look at the big picture first. Last year, Unite America Institute published a study. They're a nonpartisan nonprofit trying to figure out what the root cause of our political polarity might be. That study, based on a Gallup poll done once a month for the past 20 years, They said independents are the largest voting bloc in America. And that group went from 31% in 2004 to 49% in 2023, meaning in the nearly 24 states with a closed party primary, 10 are red states, 9 are blue states, and there are 3 swing states in the middle. In those states, 27 million independent voters are disenfranchised and denied the right for full Democratic participation in places with closed primaries. In Idaho, that accounts for nearly 300,000. That would be 28% of registered voters. And you may not think that's a lot compared to the big picture of more than 1 million registered voters in Idaho. But when you consider how much has changed since 2014, when independents and unaffiliated, as we talked about with Keith Allred, they accounted for 60% of registered Idahoans. Republicans only 32% in 2014. The state GOP points to their success, this kind of swing the other way, as the supermajority party. Others, like Allred, claim those registration rolls swelled these past dozen years because in most places in Idaho, the election is won in the Republican primary. We've talked about this many times. So in order to have a say, many people have just capitulated and joined the Republican Party. Maybe that's the reason. Open or closed primaries split the Republican Party in 2007, and it's doing that again in 2024. As you may have noticed, with their legally questionable social media videos, the current GOP leadership, including Idaho's current governor, well, they oppose Prop 1. But there are many Republicans in favor of it, including Governor Little's predecessor, Butch Otter, who was opposed to closing the primary in 2007, and former Speaker of the House, Bruce Newcomb. Idaho voters will decide for themselves to either close or crack them open in 27 days.